So I will get on there, and I will hand over to Tim, who's going to tell us about what's been going on at the castle. I think I should be able to start your slideshow if I can. Oh, there it is. In the beginning. Okay, so I think you should be there.
Okay, thanks very much, Alex. Yes, well, one of the reasons that we chose Norwich was obviously the big redevelopment that's going on of the Castle Keep at the moment. And not all of you will be aware of what's going on with it. It's a £13.5 million HLF redevelopment project. And so it seemed a useful opportunity to go through, and as the host institution, I get the benefit of half an hour rather than 20 minutes, but I'll try and stick to that. First thing, fairly obviously, is that the castle is very much a part of the city. And this is something that is very easy to see today, with, in particular, the twinning of the castle and the cathedral, the sort of secular and ecclesiastical centres of power in Norman Norwich. But what's less clear from the sort of view that you get on the streets of Norwich is just how massive the actual castle was originally, consisting of a whole series of outer bailies and bridges before you actually got to the stone keep at the centre of it. And there was also a further bailey to the north as well, underneath what is now Anglia Television. So we need to be able to try and bring alive the fact that the castle was very much a larger element within the city, as well as the fact that the keep, as we can see it today, has changed massively over the years. So, for instance, this is a drawing by Wilkins of what the castle looked like before it was refaced, and it shows the fact that the bottom, or the ground floor, if you like, was originally flint-faced rather than the ashlar facing that we can see now, and which was put on in the 1830s. It also spent a lot of its life as a prison. This is the jail that Sir John Soane built inside in the 1780s. You can just see the battlements poking out at the top. And it was a U-shaped block of cells that were originally 4 stories high until they began to collapse on themselves, and they had to strip away the top layer of cells. And they were reused when William Wilkins then redid the jail shortly after in the 1820s. And when that in turn was considered not fit for purpose, the city then bought the castle and stripped out the remains of the prison. This was done under local architect Edward Boardman, and he took out about 8 feet of soil from beneath the ground floor. The unfortunate thing is that despite the Archaeological Society coming and having a visit, nobody seems to have made any archaeological records during any of the work that was done. Boardman transformed the keep, having stripped out all of the prison period brickwork, by putting in this Romanesque style arcade, putting the roofing back in, and putting a balcony around at the principal floor level, the original floor level of the Norman keep. Since this first iteration of the Victorian style museum, it has become redeveloped, most recently between 1999 and 2000, and this is the building that you see today. The keep, as it stands, has been used for the interpretation of the medieval period, and this has been sitting sometimes uneasily alongside interpretation of the building as a prison as well. We recently had a prison display in the basement, but as we will see, that has had to be taken out because of archaeological work needed for the future project. Now, one of the issues that we've had all along, and we've known for about 20 years because of obviously the sort of public engagement and evaluation that we have to do, is the difficulty that people have with the museum and with the castle keep itself. And this was something that we've been trying to work at for a number of years. When the 2000 development was done, there was a massive stripping out of all of the display cases that were in the keep and which had accreted over the years, with the idea that we would present the castle as the #1 artefact itself. We knew that a lot of people wanted to come to actually look at the castle. And we can see the sorts of comments that we've had. I particularly like, it's a museum disguised as a castle. There was another one, more of a museum than a castle. Well, you know, the clue's in the name, Norwich Castle Museum. But at the same time, we know that a lot of people want to come to explore that historic building and its fabric. And we have, it's confusing for a whole different series of reasons. David this morning was complaining about how it's difficult to navigate your way to the castle from the car park. And these are all the sorts of challenges that we're aiming to overcome as part of this new redevelopment and make it, as the Norwich Society say, a starting place for exploring the city as a whole. So our first stab at trying to do that came in 2013 with an EU Norman Connections project through the Interreg funding stream. And we tied ourselves with a number of other English and French castles, trying to draw together the common threads that we had between us and helping to promote tourism through it. And so we were lined up with Colchester, Rochester, Hastings. Baya unfortunately dropped out because they were going through a large redevelopment, but we had very good working relationships with Caen and Falaise as well. We were also influenced in our way of working by the sort of Dover experience that we'd seen, where there was an attempt to try and recreate the sorts of interior spaces in Dover Castle that you might have seen in the 12th and 13th centuries, with the idea of redressing the room as a sort of set dressing, if you like. And this was something that we tried in our own small way through Norman Connections to begin work on by transforming certain areas of the keep. For instance, we knew that very few people went up to the balcony, even if there were a large number of display cases up there. It was very hard to actually get people to go up to that area, and yet that is the area where the features of the original 12th century keep are to be seen by people. So, for instance, the chapel area with the presbytery. So we put up a false wall with false lining to try and give some idea of what decoration might look like at the time. And the stained glass is a light box because the tall window that still survives behind it is partially bricked up from its period in use as the prison. One of the issues that we have, though, is that we are limited on this main floor by the fact it is now a balcony. And so to be able to tell other stories like what the Great Hall looked like, you are forced on either artist's reconstructions or things like this computer visualization, complete with what looks like a laminate floor, or another slightly better vision of it. But the real issue is that it's very hard to get an idea of space and the way of navigating and discovery through the castle building. And it was with that issue in mind that we had a two-day international conference on castles as part of our Norman Connections study. And we had a seminar on the third day, or the day after the conference finished, for particular members of the various castles to talk about interpretation and sort of strategies that we all might try to pursue in the way forward. And this is Edward Impey talking about the Dover Castle experience. And you can see various members of not only Colchester, Rochester, Norwich, but also from Falaise and Caen here. And we were all giving the benefit of our own different experiences to try and explore these ways. And it became very clear that one of the ways that really we might be able to best show how Norwich Castle functioned and allow people to explore it was by putting the actual floor level back in. Now, this obviously was going to cause a massive change to the Victorian recension of the museum, but there is another example of where this has been done, which is Falaise, which is slightly later than Norwich Castle, but again had lost its roof and had lost its floor levels, and so it was effectively a shell. Now, there have been a number of debates about the way in which the floor installation at Falaise was done. In particular, things like the glass floor was welcomed by Frenchmen in the basement, but not so much by ladies on the main floor. But it's a very of its time stylish French sort of response to it, with very clear modern architecture showing where those new impositions have been made, and the front entrance looking like a sort of German blockhouse, I guess you could say. However, it was an inspiration for what we might be able to do, in the sense that it was possible to put floor levels back in these historic structures and enable them to come alive. And so this is when the Gateway to Medieval England project was started as a follow-up to our Norman Connections project. And this was something that we have a number of partners with, and of course the main partner in this is the Heritage Lottery Fund. Our architectural aspirations are to reinstate the intelligibility of the place by revealing its original layout. And it gives you, if you can do that, the opportunity to actually explore a castle as it would have been in the Norman period. We also have the county's collections. This is the County Museum, and we've long worked in association with the British Museum. And so we wanted to develop that, and it was John Orner Ornstein who actually suggested, have you thought about a partnership gallery in here? Which we hadn't, although we've spent a lot of time working with the BM and we've borrowed objects like the Snettisham treasure on long-term loan. A partnership gallery was a new way of looking at things. And so the project has now got a space where we can accommodate a particular British Museum gallery of the medieval period. And we also wanted to create the sort of space that our learning programs need for a more immersive experience for our visitors, in particular for school parties, but also for the sort of families that make up the majority of our demographic, and also to create a new venue that can be a venue in its own right for other things rather than just to visit a museum. And we had initial drawings and plans worked on by Hudson Architects, a local firm in Norwich, which showed that it was possible to put the floor in, but that as part of that, there were all sorts of other things. There was a raft of other developments that were needed to be able to service that. In particularly the way that we need to now have level access for disabled people to come in, and also the way that things like services need to be changed around. So this was the initial design to do that. It's an ambitious project and programme. It's been slightly delayed in that we will be submitting our application not in February but in June, but we expect to carry on, if we're successful, in September with the delivery phase, and so our 2020 opening date is still the one that we are aiming towards. Now, we obviously need a number of learning outcomes to really help structure the way that we are approaching our display. And our display and interpretation document has a number of these key learning outcomes. The first of which is obviously Norwich Castle. It's a royal palace, and when it was built, it was one of the most prestigious buildings in contemporary Europe. If you have an argument with that, you can have an argument with Sandy sitting in the corner, because we're more or less paraphrasing what he has said about it. But it's interesting that a number of other people have since then also come up with just how enormously important architecturally it was, and what a great experiment in castle building it was. It's a building which deserves to be better known. We also wanted people to know what might seem to us to be simple things, like the fact that 1066 wrought huge changes across English society. And going back to what I was saying at the start, we have this twin secular and ecclesiastical power structure set within Norwich, which was the meteoric town in the east of England coming into being. It was an enormously successful town. It was no surprise that Norwich was the one where the cathedrals eventually settled. We also need people to remember that wealth comes from the land, and in this period it always does. If you can't eat and feed people, then you can't get wealthy either. And Norwich and Norfolk is enormously important in the period because we have enormous agricultural wealth in the east of England, and it was generating that wealth, and that's why Norwich becomes the second city in England for much of the medieval period. It was also a period of enormous European importance, with widespread trade connections and international contacts. And this is one of the reasons that William wants to put a castle here in the first place. The large Scandinavian population in East Anglia made it a vulnerable area for invasion, and so he needed to be able to control that local population. And to this we should probably add other things like the medieval world itself was one of dynamic change, a bit like we sometimes suffer with the Anglo-Saxon period, that it's sort of put in one pigeonhole, whereas it actually is 650 years worth of development. You can't look at something like Chaucer and think about it being the same as our present world. It's exactly the same in the Anglo-Saxon period, and so the 12th century is very different from the 16th century. And we also need our galleries to reflect within the castle the fact that we are not just a focus for Norfolk, but East Anglia more generally. This is one of the most important visitor attractions in East Anglia. We have to address that in our displays as well. So we need, therefore, in our new displays to take a sort of two-pronged approach. And the first of those is the castle itself. It's a fantastic Norman structure, and although the keep is now a small element of that overall castle in the landscape, which has largely been erased, we need to be able to try and tell that story. And fairly obviously, the way that we can do that is by either reconstructing what that wider castle looked like, or helping to organise things like tours or guides, the way that you can go around in the city to try and work out that Norman landscape. But also, we have a wonderful, wonderful medieval collection, which is about to become even better with the work with the British Museum curators and ourselves, so we can have this partnership gallery. It's going to give us the opportunity to have an absolutely fantastic display of medieval objects. And so we want to be able to explore the wider stories and culture of the medieval world through that. So we're now working with Hayley Sharp as our design team on the ways that we might be able to transform the castle. The slides that I'm showing you now are inevitably slightly out of date as the project hurtles onwards. But you can see in this one of the ideas for recreating the Great Hall, so that that arcade that I showed you earlier, which Boardman had put in, is going to be filled in, and the colour brought back that would originally have been within that Great Hall space, as well as something of the furniture and fittings that we might have seen there. In particular, I think it's interesting. I've got this. I can stay in screen. We've got this tapestry being worked on, and this is a community project that we're now working on with a group of volunteer ladies. They are all ladies. We did have one man who dropped out at the first site. And they're now working on a reconstruction tapestry for the castle itself, or to put in that Great Hall. And you'll be able to see an example of this in the Square Box on the Hill exhibition that's downstairs in the temporary exhibition gallery. The ladies have all been working through samplers to get themselves up to speed in learning the Bayeux stitch, which is a very specific sort of stitch. And the design is now being worked up. And it will tell the story of Hereward the Wake and the rebellion of the Three Earls in 1075. So scenes of East Anglian importance, with the idea of the sort of conceit is showing the sort of divine right of William to rule England by putting down these rebellions. And that's being drawn up by Fiona Gowan, a local artist. It's projected at the moment to be 18 metres long. So it's a sizable undertaking. And I think myself, beyond being a fantastic community project, it's actually going to be one of the sites in the Great Hall in its own right. We're also working on ways of trying to recreate the architecture, and in particular in the basement, which was created by Boardman, there are a number of ruined flint remains of the piers which once rose up through the height of the basement to support the main floor. And it's very difficult to get some idea of the sheer size of these things, let alone their importance for supporting the rest of the structure, from the sorts of basically lumps of rubble that you can see at the moment. And so we're exploring various ideas, like whether to have mesh, or at the moment we're running with the idea of having lighting hung in arches to be able to recreate the sorts of arcading that there was. It's also very clear that we need to be able to protect those rubble pier bases. We've had all sorts of erosion caused them until we had barriers put around them. And while that has worked, the present barriers are rather unsightly. And so what we want to do is try to recreate them in a more sleek way, either by boxing them in with glass or perhaps acrylic. And on the current main floor, which will become partly removed and partly our British Museum partnership gallery, you will be able to look down on that basement, as well as be able to enjoy a smorgasbord of medieval objects. Now, the issue of interpretation is obviously the sort of thorny one. In terms of the gallery itself, one of the things that I was very keen on from the very start was to make the most of the possibilities that a new build would give us. So, for instance, we're very used to seeing floor tiles in a museum, either hung up on a wall or sitting in a display case. why not put them in a display case in the floor where they were actually would have been in life? So that's one of the things that is now being built in by the architects, not without a little bit of beefing, I must say, but it is something that we're going to be able to do. But also then, how do you explore the medieval period itself? Do you look at that division of those who fight, those who work, and those who pray, and that sort of unwieldy pyramid of society? Or do you take things like chronological cues, like the Norman Conquest or the 100 Years' War or the Crusades, which most people have heard about, but I think most people would equally find it difficult to place in that story? Just like when I always ask students to put in order the Romans, the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings and the Normans. It's amazing how people get that wrong, even though to us it seems a relatively simple thing. And so one of the ways that we might be able to do it is by using chronological signposts. One of the issues in many medieval displays is the way that they become automatically put down in a thematic way. And I think that this is something that we are ourselves going to be forced down into. And it'll be very interesting in the workshop sessions to see what other ideas people have and how that might be put out. The church is very clearly one of the most obvious things to talk about because the church is at the centre of the medieval world. It's also the institution that has preserved most of its objects most effectively, and so has given them on to us to stick into museum cabinets today. Trade and travellers is another well-worn favourite. We've got some wonderful objects to be able to try to tell that story in the museum collection, whether it's Saintonge pottery, Byzantine seals, or a particularly nice Baltic style of crucifix pendant. There are other enormously important stories that are perhaps more often looked over, which are important not only from a national perspective, but also from a local perspective. Jewish Norwich was immensely important. We have the poetry of Mir ben Elijah, whose floret was in the 13th century. We've got William of Norwich, the unfortunate story of William of Norwich, used as an excuse for a lot of persecution. The young Christian boy supposedly executed as in a ritual killing by the Jews of Norwich. We've got Jernet, one of the largest, wealthiest moneylenders of Jewish England, and Mosemoka, who was depicted in this PRO exchequer roll as in not very friendly terms, and who was not just died in 1233, but was executed for coin clipping. Pastimes is another potentially well-worn theme, but it does allow us to introduce that more interactive element to people, to be able to understand what other people were being able to were playing or being able to see in their everyday objects. The dragons are an immensely important story for Norwich. The Guild of St George was your route to becoming a mayor in Norwich, and so not only is the guild of immense importance, you can see it reflected in the material culture, whether it's a spandrel from Dragon Hall in Norwich, or things like a very rare iconographic fingering depicting St George, or these pilgrim badges. But there are other stories like women and gender, which are incredibly important for us to be able to tell these days. Not because it wasn't ever considered important in the past, but it was never presented in the past. We need to be able to use displays to be able to display things like this. There are other things like simple style. We have relationships with the local art college. It'd be very nice to be able to help guide people as to why something is 12th century and why we say it's 15th century by going from the Romanesque through to the Gothic with some wonderful examples of objects that are absolutely typical of that particular style. And this gives us the difficulty, I guess, things like our wonderful chest here, which is one of only 3 in Norfolk and 3 in Kent, which almost certainly are imported from the Baltic. Do you use that to tell the story of international Gothic? Do you use it to tell the story of trade? Well, we're wrestling with those issues at the moment. Food and health. I do hate people saying they were smaller than us then, weren't they? And it's the opportunity that we have to be able to contradict certain long-held assumptions. it also gives us an opportunity to talk about how people weren't somehow retarded because they were living in the medieval period, but were actually immensely sophisticated people, and that science was developing, and the idea of the wider world and exploration was also developing. And so at the moment we are now working our way through the object list, which has been manfully put together largely by Dickon, my colleague sitting at the back, who will be hopefully chipping in later, and with Naomi and Lloyd from the British Museum. And working together, we've been trying to thrash out what sorts of overall themes and ranking of objects within cases we go for. And I'll be very interested to see what other people think as we go forward. Now, I want to end, if I can find the mouse, by just trying to get a video to play which will perhaps give you a better idea